The story of the war in Ukraine begins long before the first shots were fired in February 2022. To understand this conflict, we need to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when Ukraine declared its independence and began charting its own course as a sovereign nation. For decades after independence, Ukraine found itself caught between two worlds, the influence of Russia to the east and the pull of Western Europe to the west. This tension came to a head in 2013 when Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, suddenly abandoned plans to sign an association agreement with the European Union. This decision sparked massive protests in Kiev's Independence Square, known as the Maidan, as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians demanded closer ties with Europe and an end to corruption. The protests, which became known as the Revolution of Dignity, eventually forced Yanukovych to flee the country in February 2014. Russia's response was swift and dramatic. Within days, unmarked Russian forces began occupying the Crimean Peninsula. By March, Russia had formally annexed Crimea in a move that violated international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. Simultaneously, pro-Russian separatists, backed by Moscow, began seizing territory in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This marked the beginning of what many consider the first phase of the war, a conflict that would simmer for 8 years. Despite the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, which was supposed to establish a ceasefire, fighting continued along the front lines. Over 14,000 people died during this period, and millions were displaced from their homes. Throughout these years, Ukraine underwent significant changes. The country elected Volodymyr Zelensky, a former comedian and actor, as president in 2019 on a platform of fighting corruption and ending the war. Meanwhile, Ukraine continued to seek closer ties with NATO and the West, much to Russia's displeasure. Vladimir Putin viewed NATO's eastward expansion in Ukraine as pro-Western orientation as existential threats to Russian security and influence. In late 2021 and early 2022, satellite imagery and intelligence reports revealed a massive Russian military buildup along Ukraine's borders. Russia amassed over 190,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, and missile systems. Initially, many observers believed this was merely saber-rattling, a way for Putin to extract concessions from the West regarding NATO expansion and Ukraine's future. Putin's demands were sweeping. He wanted written guarantees that NATO would never admit Ukraine as a member, that Western military equipment would be withdrawn from Eastern European countries that had joined NATO after 1997, and essentially a rollback of the Western security architecture that had been built since the end of the Cold War. When these demands were rejected, the world watched nervously as the military buildup continued. On February 21, 2022, Putin delivered a lengthy televised address in which he denied Ukraine's right to exist as an independent nation, calling it an artificial creation of the Soviet Union. 3 days later, on February 24, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine from multiple directions, from Russia, Belarus, and the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. The invasion began with massive missile and airstrikes targeting Ukrainian military installations, airports, and government buildings. If you think this video is informative, please subscribe and like the video. Russian forces moved rapidly toward major cities, including the capital Kiev, aiming for what appeared to be a quick decapitation strike to topple the Ukrainian government. Many military analysts predicted that Ukraine would fall within days or weeks. However, Ukraine's resistance proved far more determined and effective than anyone had anticipated. Ukrainian forces, led by President Zelensky, who remained in Kiev despite offers of evacuation, mounted a fierce defense. The now famous response, "I need ammunition, not a ride," became a symbol of Ukrainian defiance. Citizens took up arms, prepared Molotov cocktails, and volunteered in massive numbers to defend their homeland. The early weeks of the war saw some of the conflict's most dramatic moments. The siege of Mariupol's Azovstal steel plant became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, as hundreds of defenders held out for months against overwhelming Russian forces. The sinking of the Russian missile cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, dealt a significant blow to Russian naval operations and morale. Perhaps most shocking were the discoveries made as Russian forces retreated from areas around Kiev in April 2022. In towns like Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel, Ukrainian forces and international observers found evidence of mass killings, torture, and other atrocities committed against civilians. Images of bodies lying in the streets sparked international outrage and led to war crimes investigations. As the war progressed, it became clear that Russia had severely miscalculated both Ukraine's will to fight and the international response. Western nations, initially hesitant to provide lethal aid, began supplying increasingly sophisticated weapon systems. The United States, European Union, and other allies implemented unprecedented economic sanctions against Russia, targeting everything from energy exports to technology imports. The conflict settled into different phases. After failing to capture Kiev and other major cities, Russian forces regrouped and focused on eastern and southern Ukraine. The battle for control of the Donbas region became a grinding war of attrition, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Ukraine launched successful counteroffensives in late 2022, recapturing significant territory in the Kharkiv region and later the strategic city of Kherson. The war has had devastating humanitarian consequences. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes, creating Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. Critical infrastructure, including power plants, water systems, and hospitals, has been systematically targeted, leaving civilians without basic services during harsh winter months. The economic costs have been staggering for both countries, with Ukraine's economy contracting by over 30% and Russia facing its worst economic crisis in decades. International involvement has only deepened over time. While Western nations have provided tens of billions of dollars in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, Russia has increasingly relied on support from countries like Iran, which has supplied drones, and North Korea, which has provided ammunition. The conflict has reshaped global alliances and highlighted the growing divide between democratic nations and authoritarian regimes. The war has also revealed the changing nature of modern conflict. Social media has played an unprecedented role in shaping public opinion and rallying international support. Drone warfare has evolved rapidly, with both sides using everything from small commercial drones to sophisticated military systems. Cyber attacks have targeted everything from government websites to civilian infrastructure, representing a new front in the digital age of warfare. As we approach the war's third year, several key questions remain unanswered. How long can both sides sustain such intensive fighting? Will international support for Ukraine remain strong as the conflict drags on? Can diplomatic efforts find a path to peace that both sides can accept? What will be the long-term consequences for European security and the global order? What's certain is that this war has already fundamentally changed Ukraine, Russia, and the broader international system. Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable resilience and unity in the face of existential threat. Russia has found itself increasingly isolated and economically weakened. The conflict has reinvigorated NATO, brought neutral countries like Finland and Sweden into the alliance, and reminded the world that the post-Cold War era of relative peace and stability is over. The story of the Ukraine war is ultimately a story about sovereignty, democracy, and the right of nations to determine their own future. It's a reminder that in the 21st century, the fundamental principles of international law and territorial integrity still matter, and that people will fight and die to defend them. As this conflict continues to unfold, its outcome will likely shape the geopolitical landscape for decades to come, determining not just Ukraine's future, but the future of the international order itself. If you would like to watch more videos like this, please subscribe and like the video.